Take a walk through almost any neighborhood early in the morning, and you'll see the same scene play out again and again. Someone pours a cup of coffee. Someone clears the breakfast table. A trash can lid closes. And something surprisingly valuable disappears. Not because it's rare, not because it's expensive, simply because most people never realized it could keep working long after breakfast was over. That's the part that bothers me. Because while many gardeners spend hundreds of dollars every year trying to grow healthier tomatoes, improve their soil, and reduce garden problems, they throw this away almost every single morning. Some have been doing it for 10 years, some for 20, without ever realizing what they had. But here's where the story gets strange. The exact same material helping one gardener grow stronger tomato plants can quietly create problems for another. Yellow leaves, slower growth, poor harvests, even soil issues that can take months to correct. And most people never connect the two, because the real mistake isn't throwing it away. The real mistake is believing there's only one way to use it. A few weeks after adding it, some gardeners notice something unexpected. Not just healthier plants, something more valuable. Less work, less troubleshooting, less constant feeding, less running outside every weekend trying to fix the same problems over and over again. Almost as if the garden has started doing more of the work itself. Meanwhile, another gardener can use the exact same material and end up creating the very problems they're trying to prevent. That's why experienced gardeners don't all use it the same way. And that's the part most gardening videos never explain. Because this isn't really a story about tomatoes. It's a story about understanding what you're putting into your soil. And the material at the center of it all? Most people scrape it into the trash before they've even finished breakfast. Used coffee grounds. So why are some gardeners getting stronger plants, healthier soil, and less work from something most people throw away, while others unknowingly create the exact opposite result? And what do experienced gardeners understand that most people never discover? For years, I thought tomatoes rewarded whoever worked the hardest. More fertilizer, another feeding, another Saturday spent trying to fix the same problem. And honestly, that's how most gardening advice sounds. If something isn't working, add something. Buy something. Do something. Work a little harder. But after a while, I started noticing something strange. The gardeners carrying home the biggest harvests weren't always the busiest. They weren't spending every weekend in the garden. They weren't constantly hauling bags home from the garden center. Yet somehow their plants looked stronger. Their harvest seemed heavier. And that observation slowly changed the way I looked at gardening. Because the biggest harvests weren't coming from the people doing the most work. They were coming from the people who had quietly eliminated unnecessary work. The people who found ways to get more from their garden while doing less. And one of those shortcuts was sitting in a place most of us never think to look. The kitchen trash. By now, the answer probably sounds almost too simple. Coffee grounds. Not rare. Not expensive. Not hidden. Just something most people scrape into the trash before breakfast. And honestly, that's exactly why it bothered me. Because while some gardeners spend years hauling bags home from the garden center, buying products that promise bigger harvests, they throw this away every single morning. But the real surprise isn't that coffee grounds can help tomatoes. Most gardeners already know that. The real surprise is why experienced gardeners save them. Most people hear coffee grounds and immediately think fertilizer. That's the easy answer. It's also the answer that misses the point. The gardeners saving coffee grounds weren't looking for another way to feed tomatoes. They were looking for a way to stop doing so much work. They weren't trying to spend more weekends fixing problems in the garden. They were trying to build a garden that needed less from them. Most beginners use coffee grounds to feed plants. Experienced gardeners use them to reduce work. And that's where things start to get interesting, because the biggest advantage has surprisingly little to do with feeding tomato plants. In fact, if that's the reason you're saving coffee grounds, you may be missing the most valuable part entirely. So what exactly were experienced gardeners seeing in this everyday waste that everyone else kept overlooking? At first, I thought the explanation was simple. Coffee grounds go into the soil. The soil improves. The tomatoes grow better. Easy answer. Except, that wasn't what I kept seeing. One afternoon, I brushed aside a thin layer of soil beneath a tomato plant and noticed something most people never stop to look at. Tiny roots were reaching into cool pockets of moisture. Earthworms had opened little tunnels I never had to dig. And beneath all of it, the garden was doing quiet work I didn't have to do myself. That was the moment something clicked. The healthiest gardens didn't seem to depend on gardeners doing more work. They depended on gardeners creating the right conditions and then getting out of the way. Think about that. The goal wasn't to work harder. The goal was to stop solving the same problems over and over again. A handful of coffee grounds won't transform a garden overnight, but it can become one small piece of a system that keeps working long after you've gone back inside. And here's where things become even more interesting. Because the first difference people notice usually isn't happening underground at all. It shows up somewhere everyone can see. But this is also where many gardeners get fooled. Because when a plant starts looking better, most people assume they should keep doing more of the same thing. More grounds. More often, a little closer to the stem. And that's how a shortcut quietly turns back into work. The strange part is that the mistake usually doesn't show up right away. At first, everything still looks fine. In fact, that's exactly what makes it so easy to miss. Then a few quiet weeks go by. Nothing dramatic. No miracle overnight. No sudden explosion of growth. And that's usually when most people stop paying attention. But one morning, something feels different. You walk past the tomato plant and pause. The leaves seem darker than you remember. The stems feel a little sturdier. New flowers are showing up where there was empty space before. Not everywhere, just enough to make you look twice. But the real difference isn't just what the plant looks like. It's what you no longer feel forced to fix every weekend. And that's what makes it so interesting. The change doesn't feel like the result of more work. It feels like the plant is finally doing more of the work itself. Less struggling, less recovering, more growing. Exactly the kind of leverage gardeners spend years looking for. But here's where the story splits in two. Because while one gardener sees those changes, another sees something completely different. And that's where the real problem begins. At first, both gardeners think they're doing the same thing. Both save coffee grounds. Both carry them out to the garden. Both spread them around their tomatoes. But a few weeks later, the gardens tell two different stories. In one bed, the plants look stronger. In the other, something feels off. The leaves lose their deep color. Growth slows. The plant seems stuck in place. And the strange part is that many people blame the coffee grounds. I used to think that too. Until I looked closer, the problem wasn't what they were using. It was what was happening after they used it. A damp layer sitting too long. Air struggling to move. Moisture trapped where it shouldn't be. The coffee grounds didn't fail. The method failed. And if you've ever sprinkled coffee grounds around a plant and walked away, the next part may be the most important thing you'll hear today. Because one small change determines which of those two gardens becomes yours. This is usually the point where people accidentally turn a helpful shortcut into extra work. And that's ironic. Because most gardeners start using coffee grounds hoping the garden will ask less from them. But one wrong move makes it ask for more. The first mistake often happens before they even leave the kitchen. The grounds are still warm, still wet, so they get tossed straight into the garden. It feels harmless, maybe even efficient. But a few weeks later, the soil sometimes tells a different story. Then comes the mistake that catches almost everyone. More. A little today, another handful next week, then a little more just to help things along. Except plants rarely respond well when we try to rush them. But the next mistake is even easier to miss. The grounds end up piled right against the stem, exactly where people think they're helping most. And then there's timing. The mistake hardly anyone notices until after the results show up. The gardeners who get the best results usually aren't doing more. They're doing less, just more intentionally. Before we go any further, let's make this practical. For a simple tomato feeding, start with about 2 tablespoons of dried, used coffee grounds. Mix them into about 1 liter of water. Let the mixture sit for roughly 24 hours. Then apply about 200 to 300 milliliters around the root zone of each tomato plant. And you don't need to do this constantly. Once every 2 to 3 weeks during active growth is usually enough. The first thing they do is simple. They let the coffee grounds dry completely. That one habit prevents several problems before they ever have a chance to appear. Then comes the part that surprises most people. Notice how small those numbers are. Because experienced gardeners aren't trying to overwhelm the system. They're trying to support it. And good results often come from letting nature do part of the work for you. After about 24 hours, the water changes color. A small sign that something is happening. And before you use it, there is one group of gardeners who need to be even more careful. People growing tomatoes in containers. And if you're growing tomatoes in containers, pay even closer attention. Garden beds forgive mistakes. Containers often don't. If you're growing in pots, buckets, or patio containers, start with about half that amount and see how the plant responds before adding more. Finally, they use only a small amount around each tomato plant, enough to help the soil, enough to support the roots, but not enough to create new problems. And strangely, the biggest reward has very little to do with coffee grounds at all. Just when it seems the story ends with coffee grounds, something else quietly enters the picture. Eggshells. And this is where the pattern becomes more important than the ingredient. Coffee grounds were never the whole story. They were just the first example of a bigger rule. The smartest gardens are often built from things other people throw away. Most of them never make it past breakfast. They crack. They hit the trash. And that's the end of them. Or so it seems. What surprised me wasn't that experienced gardeners saved coffee grounds. It was realizing coffee grounds were never the real secret. They were just the first clue. Not because either one is some miracle ingredient. Actually, that's the wrong way to think about it. The gardeners getting the best results rarely focus on individual ingredients. They focus on systems. Small things that work together. Small things that keep giving back. Over time, those scraps stop looking like waste. They start looking more like leverage. And that's where the story gets bigger than tomatoes. Because the most valuable thing growing in that garden isn't always the plant. It's the system supporting it. This is the mistake that catches people after they've already seen success. At first, everything looks good. The plants respond. The leaves look healthier. The garden seems happier. And that's exactly why the mistake happens. People start thinking, if a little helped, maybe more will help even more. That's usually where the trouble begins. Because coffee grounds aren't valuable for being used in large amounts. They're valuable because they help support a balance. Once that balance disappears, the results can start moving in the wrong direction. I've seen gardeners do everything right for weeks, then undo part of that progress simply because they got impatient. And honestly, that's the warning I wish more people talked about. If the soil smells sour, if mold appears, if the soil stays wet for long periods, stop and let it breathe. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do for a garden is stop adding things and let the system rebalance itself. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do for a garden is stop before you think you need to. Because the goal was never to do more. The goal was always to let the garden do more of the work for you. Picture yourself walking into the garden about 6 weeks from now. Not to fix something. Not to rescue a struggling plant. Just to look. The morning sun hits the leaves. And something feels different. The tomato plants look fuller, yes. But what you really notice is the quiet. No panic. No rushing outside to fix yellow leaves. No feeling that the garden has become another job. But oddly enough, that's not what most gardeners notice first. What they notice is what they didn't have to do. Less correcting, less worrying, less running back and forth trying to solve the next problem. Think about that for a moment. Most people spend years looking for ways to grow more. The experienced gardeners are usually looking for ways to do less. And when a garden starts giving back more than it takes, something unexpected happens. People notice. A neighbor slows down, looks over the fence, and asks the question every gardener secretly enjoys hearing. What are you doing differently? But here's the strange part. The tomatoes aren't the real payoff. They're just the first sign that the system is working. Coffee grounds may be one of the most overlooked things people throw away. But they're probably not the most valuable. There are other kitchen scraps quietly disappearing into trash cans every day that experienced gardeners have been saving for years. Some of them may be sitting in your kitchen right now. And some gardeners have been throwing them away for 20 years without realizing what they had. Think about that. 20 years of harvest that never happened. 20 years of soil that could have been doing more work on its own. Because once you learn how to turn waste into leverage, you stop looking at scraps the same way. And you stop looking at your garden the same way too. That's when the real rabbit hole begins.